Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Melbourne Athletic Development Podcast. Today, we are very lucky to have Sam Toll back with us. Obviously, we got some awesome feedback on our previous discussion with Sam talking about preparation for the marathon. And so what we thought we would do is talk to Sam a little bit more about injuries, particularly relating to running, because he can bring a unique experience to that, which is that he is a developing elite athlete in this space. And we thought it would be really good for him to combine his knowledge of the sports performance side of things, being an athlete himself, but also the impact that has on his clinical knowledge and his clinical understanding as a physiotherapist, and also his understanding, particularly as we mentioned last time, of shoe technology. So Sam, thank you very much for joining us once again.
No problem at all.
Running injuries. All right. Why do they happen? Especially in distance running, we see lots of them, and people always come, the first question they ask invariably is, why did this happen? Why do you, in the general community of people who like running, we spoke about it last time, but every man and his dog is in a run club now, right? Why are they developing injuries?
There's obviously going to be a multifactorial aspect to everything, but the most common reason is people's load increasing beyond what they're capable of doing. Now, everyone's load tolerance is different. For someone who's very new to running, essentially their load tolerance is close to zero, particularly if they don't have a sporting background. And so even a little bit of an increase in running, if not managed well and kind of carefully progressed, can lead to some overuse injuries. For someone who's running, a lot, their total volume might be really, really high, but if their actual increases are pretty small relative to their capacity, they may actually have no issues.
When you say relatively small, what parameters do you use, and is that variable? And more importantly, over what time period as well? Because can you make increases each day, each week, each month? How do you actually think about that conceptually?
Typically, we probably work off, from a timing perspective, we work off the fact that a lot of runners will have like a weekly schedule because that's just the way most of our lives are set up. So you look at progressing probably per week. The most common one that gets used as increasing is via mileage sort of base and distance running, that is at least. It's not always perfect, as I'll probably talk through in a little bit about like different factors that can affect your training as well as just volume. But looking at increases in volume over kind of a weekly sort of schedule is probably the way that we go about managing it for a lot of new runners in particular.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I think the question you then have to ask is increasing to what? Right? Because I feel like that's the biggest thing that people make not clear at the start is like, what are they actually working towards? Are you just increasing by 5 or 10% per week until you get to 1 million kilometers a week? Like, what are you going towards? And the bigger thing is, I think that a lot of the times, and I think we spoke about this last time, I mentioned Parker Velby, and her having success in the NCAA cross country and all of that kind of thing. And the fact that I think a lot of the times in training, we have these numbers that are basically arbitrary, right? They're based on, this is what good athletes have done, so therefore I need to get to, we mentioned 100 kilometers per week, or if you're a distance runner that's doing marathons, maybe 160 to 200 kilometers. But there's actually no rule about that. And I always find that really interesting, why people attach themselves to that number and say, if I don't get there, I'm not going to be prepared to do this level of performance.
The other thing it makes me think of too, John, is just to give you some context there, John and I have spoken before about different types of training models for sprinters, and that you have different types of profiles within sprinters, and you need to be able to identify what type of profile that person is and adapt their training to it accordingly. Do we need to, like as John's alluding to, I think that too in some way, do we need to also consider then the type of distance runner we're talking about? Because do we expect to see that some people are going to deal better with doing, say, some higher intensity training but at a lower volume, and then obviously vice versa as well?
I think absolutely you do. I think we're getting probably more towards that performance space again, but like to get the most out of an athlete, you always have to individualize it to some extent.
I would actually argue against that. I actually think I think it's really important from an injury standpoint as well, because one of the common training errors that you see that leads to some type of injury is that a particular training model is not appropriate for the individual phenotype. And so, like a good example of this is, and this is something that John and I have talked about with
Freak.
it's sprinters.
Well, we spoke about with Freak.
Of course, yeah. When you think about muscle fiber typology, now, I mean, in distance runners, you think they're going to be all predominantly more slow twitch, but there certainly is going to be some different profiles within that slow twitch community and profile. And then thinking about how, based on whether you have maybe a little bit more fast twitch or a little bit more slow twitch, you may be someone who responds better to higher intensity or interval-based stuff and maybe lower volume versus doing a lot more volume at sub-maximal intensities. And whether you see a similar principle applied to distance runners as well.
So just to be clear, like, you're not against the individualization approach for that, but you meant it can be used for like more introductory sort of athletes rather than necessarily just for performance athletes.
Certainly, but also I think too from the injury perspective as well. Like I've certainly seen it with some of the sprinters that we see where they're doing all the right things in terms of building up their tissue capacity. They've got good biomechanics, but there's issues with their training load, but not specifically that they've done too much too quickly, but the actual training model that they're using is not appropriate for the individual phenotype or muscle phenotype. So they may be someone who's an ultra fast twitch athlete who should be doing maybe 1-2 sessions a week of really close to their maximal intensity to really maximize building up their strengths, but are instead doing 4 or 5 sessions a week of doing more tempo type stuff and actually creating a lot of fatigue in the process and making themselves more susceptible to injury.
It's really funny actually that you bring up that, like, so potentially some people that are like more fast twitchy doing some of these longer events, because that happens all the time. Like, how many footy players do we know that are like, they played footy for all of their career, they're retired for a bit, they come back, they find distance running in their like 30s and decide they want to increase and they're going to run a marathon now. Like maybe they were real fast twitchy.
Absolutely.
And that's just completely changed now what their sort of, I guess, event that they're training for is. But they go and train like a slow twitch athlete all the time and they just go long. And like this stuff's important. Like I don't think anyone can run a marathon without doing volume. Like it's not possible.
You're not going to be able to achieve it doing 100-meter repeats.
No.
Yeah.
But you're, to an extent, the sort of training that might actually get the most out of their bodies isn't what they necessarily do. So it's a really interesting idea.
Here's a question for you then. Even like you would probably have seen more people do this, of people who have done really well in, say, and they might be community level, but they've done really well in a half or a marathon, but come at it with very different volumes of training. Have you seen that in people that like someone was doing 100 Ks a week, another one was doing like 30, and they kind of ran the same time?
Definitely. And I think that's really common around that sort of like 10K half marathon distance. You get some people who just like
rock up.
There's one person I knew who literally like, he was a cyclist like previously. So he has like a lot of metabolic training.
Base,
but essentially he ran once a week. Like he was running a total of about 20 kilometers a week. It was just one long run a week. Then he'd just do some stuff on the bike and he was strength training to try and kind of build up his other stuff. And he ran like a 90-minute half marathon. Like, and he's not like a, high elite performance guy, but like in the general population, he's running very, very fast. And then you've got some people who are like building up very slowly and kind of doing all of the right things. And, they run 2 hours. Very different people can have different approaches to the same event. And basing it off what you've done in your past, bringing it back to that sort of like loading as well. Like what's your ability to deal with different types of load, whether it's the type of training you're doing, the volume of training you're doing, it all contributes to what's going to work best for you to achieve the goal that you want to get.
Because the thing that, like, I always have this conversation with people, and Jack and I spoke about this more recently when we spoke about sprinting. The question is always like, well, how much volume do I need to do? And my answer is always, doesn't matter the level of the person, is are they actually able to carry out the task at the end of the day, right? So like, if, for instance, your task is one round of 100 meters, and that's all they need to be able to do, then the amount of volume of training they need to do is not much, right? Maybe, as you said, they can get away with running once a week. And for your community level track athlete, if they train once a week, that probably is going to prepare them well enough to do that. And as you just mentioned with a half marathon, if someone does one 20-kilometer a week run on their long run, they go out on a Saturday or Sunday and just do 20 kilometers. Unless they're going towards it, they're more general in nature, do they need to run more than that? Because are they going to fail due to the lack of volume in that case? Especially if they are doing other things that support their tissue capacity, they're doing other things that support their, aerobic function. Like as you mentioned, this gentleman was a cyclist. I think very heavily about like, is their performance being limited by that? And that's where I think people get caught in the narrative of like, in order to be a runner, I need to do this. And it gets them in a lot of trouble injury-wise, rather than saying, well, actually, I only actually need to be able to do this much, and not getting caught up in the more is better, or feeling like that's an important thing to do just because historically that's what's been done.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to bring it back to what the goal of that athlete is. So if your goal is to do your first half marathon and you've never even touched that distance before, like, there's some people I know who would want to do, they want to do the distance ahead of time.
Yeah,
and they want to get as close to it as possible.
Are you judgmental about that? Because I feel like some people are like, you've already done the half marathon. Why are you doing it again on the weekend?
Well, it's like, from my perspective.
Do you want to hear a funny story? I had this conversation yesterday with someone who, the gentleman, he's a real nice guy. He works actually for a shoe company, and he was saying, we're talking about run clubs and all of that kind of thing, and he was saying that he got really pissy because someone from one of the, like where they work, had done their first half marathon, but it basically, he went, I don't know, and he'd run quite fast, and he went and checked like his Strava, and the guy had full scoped out the course and done the course like 2 or 3 times and all that. He goes, this is bullshit, he's cheating. Like he's actually taking this way too seriously, and then he's claiming that he, did this great performance. And he's like, he said to me, I don't rate that. And I was like, well, good on him. But he's like, it was like a fun run. He's like, he's taken it way too seriously. He's scoped out the course and done it 3 times.
Yeah, it's like, and then I'll claim it as my debut. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's a big one, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's funny when you've got people who are really there's a lot of new runners who are very worried about the distance being their limiting factor.
I feel like in the marathon that's fair.
Yes.
In the half, I don't think it is.
Well, that's the thing. But even in the marathon too, if your goal is to complete it, obviously you need to try and develop the ability to complete it on the day. But I think people often get like a bit stuck with, how close do I need to get without burning myself prior to the event?
That's a good question. What is that number? Is there a distance, or is there an amount of time, or does it need to be a certain distance away or time away from what you think the total performance will? Say if you think, okay, I'm going to run 4 hours for the marathon. Do you need to be, out there on your feet for 4 hours at some point, even if you're not going at race pace? Do you need to do 3.5? Do you need to do, 35, 38? Like what do you actually think is a reasonable amount of stress that person needs to be exposed to before they do marathon? And then there'll be a follow-up question, which is how close. But what amount of stress do you think someone needs to be undertaking before they actually undertake their main, event?
The goal is important. If they're looking at it from like, I've run a marathon before and now I really want to get under 4 hours. That's my goal. You've already kind of conquered that distance before. You've probably got a little bit of training history behind you. You can probably get a little bit closer to the kind of volume at race pace that you might want to do. So from a numbers perspective, maybe they're looking at doing a long run where they're out there for close to 3 hours. I would say there's very rare occasions where people should be going out for more than 3 hours. Why is
that? Do you think it increases injury risk?
Yeah.
What do you think happens if you're out there for longer than that? Do you think it's just too much stress in a training kind of environment?
Yeah, I think like if you're doing that, you're creating this massive day in the middle of your week, or at the end of your week, depending on whatever you do it, that can essentially create issues with training that you might want to do to support your actual race day that you're then unable to do properly because you're kind of essentially completely like wasted based on that one really acute loading period compared to what you're necessarily.
Here's a question for you, because as a sprint coach, I see it so differently, right? And for me, we're looking for those improved sessions or those spikes where you're actually trying to get a huge sort of stimulus out of them. Like I think it's one of the big problems that a lot of sprinters and sprint coaches get wrong is it's not like, whilst it can be, as people start to mature as athletes, the stress needs to come generally from the intensity side of things. And so you are actually looking for large magnitude stresses, whether that be in an individual session or a cluster of sessions, right? In distance running, that's not really the case. It's much more an accumulation of overall volume, isn't it?
Yeah, and you can look at a week more generally rather than just the run too. So particularly when you're looking at someone getting them to the start line for their first marathon or half marathon or whatever it is, like, yes, that long run's important and you want to build that up to get to the point where they're comfortable attacking that race distance. But like, you've got other runs in the week that help build your strength too. They build your aerobic capacity. They, if you've got a speed session in there, they're building that sort of like threshold pace as well, what you can actually maintain for your race. It shouldn't be all in on the, I guess that's Sunday long run, which is what it will be on the day of the event.
I notice this a lot. This is a discussion I have with people that do come in with injuries from distance running, that they do seem to bias towards, I think there's a bit of a mental thing with the long run as it being, it's the most important thing of the week. Whereas my understanding of it, and you can correct me if you're wrong, is like, whilst it's an important part, it's not necessarily ahead of anything else. But I feel like people seem to bias towards that because it feels the most similar to what their race is going to be. And they're like, no, I've got to get my long run in. And I've said to people in the past, when we say if you're managing some sort of injury, of like, we're better off getting, 4 or 5 days of running in this week rather than one really big 2.5 hour run and then being sore for 3 or 4 days just because you think that it's what you need to do. Is that something that you have noticed, that people seem to bias towards the long run because it feels so similar to your race?
100%. It's also, and I think this is like a separate thing, but like, think about like social media coming through running as well now, and like what the effect that like Strava has on people. They just love the long run's impressive.
I actually ultimately think Strava is a big negative. People don't agree with me, but I think it's a big negative. I think it becomes
too competitive.
It becomes a pissing contest.
Yeah.
Right? Like, honestly, you ever talk to any distance runners, all they do is say like, oh yeah, did you see such and such as Strava? And like, oh, I was watching, like, I've seen their sessions, like they're training well. And I'm like, you're stalking someone's training. That's very odd.
Yeah, and it also never tells you the whole story. Like,
of course.
I think one of the big long runs are one of them, but there's a couple of types of training that it can get actually really negatively affected by watching what other people do on Strava.
What do you think they are? Because there would definitely be some listeners who are going, oh, I've done that.
Yeah, long run's a big one. Doing your long run a little bit quick or going a little bit further than maybe you should do because, 25K looks better than 23.6K or whatever it is. Like,
what's on that? And I'm diverting, but what's with the weird OCD of distance runners and a round number?
I don't know. I like a round number. It's just like...
So you just confirmed exactly what I'm saying.
But like, that's literally all it is. If you think logically about it, like, what's the difference? There isn't one.
Well, I remember a physio and a colleague of ours, he's a distance runner and used to train with Brady Trelfall. Very good athlete, obviously. And Brady, he used to always have a go at Brady because he'd do his run and then he'd be running up and down the street so that he ended up finishing his kilometers for the week or whatever. And I'm just
doing laps at the car park because you want to get that round number. And realistically, you've probably got GPS error, which means that it's not accurate anyway.
Yeah.
Like, what did that extra 20 seconds do to get you to that nice 25K? It doesn't necessarily make sense, but people do it. And people often run faster on those things so that it looks more impressive as well, rather than kind of backing off the pace to make sure they train in the appropriate zone. You're doing a long run that's meant to be at, zone 2. They might increase and just like, do a bit of pickup at the end because it makes their overall pace look a little bit better or whatever it is.
Well, I was actually going to ask then, thinking about injuries in recreational distance runners, and you're talking about training load. Is that something that you see as a common error a lot of recreational runners make, is that they're actually trying to run a certain volume at an intensity that's actually inappropriate for their overall performance, let alone their actual training history?
Yeah. I think it's people will follow like a a training program that maybe they have a coach, maybe they find it online, whatever it is.
Mm.
They've got like these sessions that are listed there. But if you take just the sessions based on what's like written in front of you, like 30-minute run, I don't know, doing 5 kilometers as your interval session. If you're not doing them with the appropriate intensity, then you essentially don't get both the benefit and the recovery out of different types of runs. And you start moving away from what we consider a safe training progression to then just kind of being like, well, let's roll the dice and see if I get away with it this week.
I think the other big issue with that too is psychologically, people like to feel stuffed at the end of a training session. And the reality is you may not necessarily need to do that, particularly all the time.
Yeah, there should be. And again, I mentioned there are certain types of sessions that I think get really negatively affected by things like Strava. One of the big ones is something like a threshold session where, say, you're going out for 20 minutes or 30 minutes and you're supposed to run at your threshold pace that time. At the end of that session, you shouldn't be gassed. You should have been able to keep going if you had to, like for a fair amount longer. But people will go, oh, I've only got 5 minutes left. Like, let's pick up the pace a little bit. Let's start maybe running at above that threshold pace. And, if you had the measurements going, their heart rate's going up, their lactate's beginning to accumulate, all this stuff that means they're no longer training in the appropriate zone. And people will do that because, I bought my, say if they're thresholding at 3:30 pace, they spend most of the time at 3:31, 3:32 pace. Oh, if I run a 3:20 last kilometer, it was a 3:29 for my average. Things like that people do in order to make their Strava look better as well. And it can negatively affect what your actual training load looks like for the week. And sometimes you've just got to, and this is where getting rid of something like Strava can be very helpful.
Well,
check your ego at the door.
It's actually something, you made me think of something of whether when someone particularly is managing an injury, whether you tell them, I need you to actually go off Strava, or whether for a beginner, it's actually not a good idea to even get on there in the first place. Because I think, as you said, it's going to potentially encourage people to undertake training that's not necessarily, and I think this is the point which Jack was making earlier about individualization. It's not necessarily that it needs to be always very nuanced towards their profile or whatever, because they may not know what their profile is yet, but it's very nuanced to the previous training history. Like just because your friend who's never run before either is increasing their Ks by 10%. If you're not tolerating that, then slow it down. Stay at 5% volume increase per week, or don't increase the pace just because your mate who's on Strava who's also doing it seems to be increasing their pace.
Well, and actually with that in mind, I imagine can be a common training error depending on your training, if you have a training partner as well, whether they're actually at a
training
similar
group,
level.
Yeah. Comparing yourself and doing the same thing as the people around you can be, like, a training group environment can actually be really helpful, and it can be motivating, and it can get the most out of your training sessions. It can slow you down if you run with a group appropriately. It stops you from kind of going after paces if you're going for a jog by yourself, for example. But it can have the opposite effect as well if you kind of don't have the discipline to go, you know what, I couldn't imagine beating that person in a race. Why am I trying to do my threshold with them? Like, they're currently a better athlete than me.
Do you see that a fair bit?
Yeah. I love again. I bring up thresholds all the time because it's the one that I think people do all the time. They'll list something as
just so that people are very aware, because we've spoken about it a bit.
Yes,
and we mentioned last time. Explain what a threshold session is, and maybe give an example of a threshold session, and then maybe explain how people mess that up and then potentially leave themselves at risk of getting injury.
So, a true threshold session is essentially bringing yourself up to the point that you can kind of maintain for roughly an hour without accumulating things at your muscle level that essentially start negatively impacting your performance. And that gets there's an inflection point where your lactate goes up. So it's called a lactate threshold. And that's kind of where that roughly comes from. So it should be an intensity that you can maintain for that sort of hour-long distance. But people will often train slightly above that to try and bring that up. A true threshold session, like if you go and, for example, run 30-minute threshold, is you get to that point and your goal is to stay as close as possible to that point for the duration of your session. So you can imagine if someone's threshold is slightly higher than the other, like they run a little bit faster at threshold, one person's going after it. By the end of that run, they are not running at threshold anymore. They're
No.
running it closer to race pace. And that's where you change the purpose of the session and you change, I guess, that loading impact that can then be an injury risk.
Yeah. In terms of what that does to injury, how do you see that impacts? Is it just that like they're fatigued and then they're not recovering and then therefore the next time they go out to run? Or do you think that there's actually risk in the moment? Because clearly with distance running, you don't get a hell of a lot of acute injuries. It's not like it does happen. People strain calves particularly, but usually it's more of these overuse type injuries.
Yeah.
People develop tendinopathies, particularly around the foot and ankle and calf complex. They might develop knee pain, anterior or ITB, those kind of things.
Yeah.
So,
or bony stress injuries.
bony stress injuries.
We can talk about the really common ones soon, but I guess, like you say, most injuries come on insidiously. They don't come on at that exact moment. And so most of the risk comes from accumulating running too hard, too frequently, and not doing things at the right intensity so that you don't recover from them. So like, it's the same thing. Like if you do a race, like, I'm not saying that you can't run above threshold because you're going to get an acute injury. But if you're doing one of these sessions once per week and every single time you're running above, it's a higher injury risk than if you backed off that pace because you're not going to be recovered in the context of your week.
Yeah. And I think we can probably handball to you, Jack, because you probably can explain the physiology behind it. But the reason that you're not recovering from the fatigue is that each of these tissues, whether it's bone, whether it's tendon tissue, whether it's, the muscle tissue itself, has like cell turnover time. Right. And so we get some degradation, we get some signaling for, uptake of increases. And if you get that wrong, or you're basically compounding those downward cycles that occur from the stress of the run, then potentially you leave yourself in a position where you're actually slowly degrading that tissue. And Jack, do you want to maybe explain like what happens with bone turnover or what happens with tendon turnover? Because I think you probably understand it a little bit better, but give us a bit of an idea of why, if you, for instance, do too many hard sessions in a row, you may end up developing, say, bone stress.
Well, I think he actually explained it pretty well, but I think this comes back to a concept you and I have discussed before, John, of the hormesis. So when you think about distance running as an example, and you think about a lot of the training encompasses doing longer duration, submaximal intensities, you're doing that to create a certain metabolic stress so that you're actually building up more aerobic capacity, the better to utilize oxygen as or oxidation as an energy substrate to be able to continue contraction of the neuromuscular system. And then you're obviously creating a stress to the soft tissue system and the hard tissue system as well. But then based on that individual's profile, that threshold to where you're applying an adequate stress to be able to create enough signal to the body to go, all right, I need to increase the stiffness of the tendons or the amount of density of connective tissue around the muscle, or even the potentially the density of the bone. Though distance running is perhaps not the best way to do that. If we pass that threshold too much, we're obviously going to create a signal where there's too much inflammation, there's too much oxidative stress, and it may provide a signal to, say, bone, where you get an increase of osteoclasts, i.e. the cells or the molecules that break down bone, versus the osteoblasts, the cells that actually create bone. And
if you don't get that balance right, because there's a nice harmony that seems to occur where there is some breakdown from that oxidative stress, and then your body responds and says, okay, that was an appropriate amount of signal. I need to increase osteoblastic activity. If you keep pushing that down and increasing the osteoclasts behavior, you end up in this position where it's more bone breakdown than more bone growth. And then that's where the tissue starts to degrade.
Correct. And as you both alluded to as well, is most of the time with distance running injuries, it's a gradual insidious onset. It doesn't just happen from one session where it's like, oh, I've got a stress fracture. Over time, you're starting to get thinning of the bone, and then it might develop what's called a stress reaction. But then eventually you might actually develop a fracture line. And so similarly, when you think about tendinopathies, is why do people get Achilles tendon pain from distance running? Well, the signals over time are leading to structural changes within the tendon where it isn't able to tolerate the same type of training loads, and then starts to lead to some of the characteristics associated with tendinopathy. And then all of a sudden you start to get pain, and then that starts to affect your ability to perform and run. And actually that also brings us to another point, because something I think that's useful when you think of it that way is we've obviously discussed a lot about training loads and making sure that we have an understanding of what is the appropriate amount of training volume and intensity based on your training history and potentially like your individual phenotype. But then I think about, are there other types of stimulus that we can apply outside of running to be able to maximize the strength and integrity of these tissue systems that can break down over time and develop overuse injuries in running?
Yeah. Well, I think that and Sam can answer this, but I think that goes to the next part, which is like, what are the other things that contribute to injury?
Well, and that's actually a good way to think of it too, because if we talk about the mechanical signals that we just mentioned before, that's not the only thing associated with remodeling of tissue, because we need that signal that will determine whether we're going to get tissue development or tissue breakdown. But then we also need to think about, well, what are the other things that support tissue? And I think one of the big ones that you're probably alluding to, John, is, are you giving the body the appropriate nutrients, the appropriate building blocks to lay down new tissue? But then also, are you providing the right recovery mechanisms as well to make sure that you optimize the ability to clear out all those inflammatory mediators and oxidative stress and all that stuff?
That wasn't what I was thinking, but
what were you thinking, John?
I think John's probably alluding to distance runners' least favourite activity and physio's favourite activity, which is probably strength and conditioning training.
I don't know if that's physio's favourite activity, to be honest.
Maybe. I don't know. It's definitely distance runners.
We've opened up all these other things to discuss now, so
no,
let's go.
100%. I think you're spot on, Jack. I think the question that I'm thinking about is, okay, we obviously have spoken about volume and training load. I think that there's other key factors that influence, and the two big ones that we've spoken about a lot are obviously things like biomechanics, and the other one is tissue, characteristics and behavior and properties.
Yeah, actually, I was just going to mention, I think this is a good way to think about distance running as well. For someone with no training history, distance running actually might provide an anabolic stimulus for your tissue. So when I say that, I mean it actually may improve things like your strength of your calf or the stiffness properties of your tendon, or maybe even to some extent even the bone, depending on how you're training. But over time, particularly when you get to, say, your level where you're doing high amounts of volume, you're obviously working towards a marathon, the training stimulus that you're applying to your body with running is about energy efficiency. Like, you need to become more efficient to be able to maintain a certain speed over a certain time. And that actually can be associated with a catabolic stress.
Can you explain that? Because I was like shocked when I kind of realized it was like, the reason that a lot of distance runners get bone stress is because their body is offloading tissue on purpose, being like, we need to get lighter, right? And the aerobic stimulus itself is not helping that. So it's a really interesting game. If you don't offset that in some way with some other anabolic stimulus, it becomes catabolic.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it sort of gives you an insight as to where our threshold is of how much distance or aerobic type of stimulus you should be applying, because there seems to be an important balance to provide anabolic stimulus, i.e. growth, versus catabolic stimulus, i.e. breakdown. And I'm not saying, just to be careful, I'm not saying that distance running means that you're going to break down eventually, but...
No, it doesn't. But it's interesting because you weren't there, but I don't know if they mentioned it to you, but when we did our master's work through...
the Masters of Strength and Conditioning.
Through Cowan. At one point, I know that they had a good relationship with the football teams over in WA, West Coast Eagles and the Dockers. And I believe it was West Coast. At the time, they actually were getting a lot of stress fracture injuries. And they realized that for a number of the players, their bone density was reduced for what they would consider for a young, healthy population. And the reason that they concluded that was happening was because the amount of aerobic training they were doing had been increased, and they hadn't been necessarily putting a big focus on their strength training. And so they brought ECU in to help them, and what they did was they really increased over. I'm sure it was progressive, but they really tried to increase the importance and need of their strength training. And they started to see a normalization in the bone density measures done, obviously in the bone scans, but also in the number of stress fracture type injuries that they were getting, which I thought was really interesting because it suggests that even in a sport like that is, it's not necessarily just purely an aerobic activity, but if you over-index on one area, then as you mentioned before, Jack, it can be catabolic.
So what are your thoughts then, Sam? How do we actually prevent this, or how do you find a balance between the amount of running volume you do and then other types of training stimulus to make sure you maintain good tissue integrity and capacity?
Yeah. We've kind of deep dived into a little bit of that, I guess, what's going on at a more cellular level there. I think bringing it back to what we consider like you're actually doing when you're doing these activities is like we're essentially trying to improve your capacity to be able to deal with the amount of stress you're going to put onto like an area. So if you're talking about, you go for a big run and you're going to put all, potentially break down some of this tissue, like breaking, increasing that osteoclastic activity, you want to then be doing essentially stuff outside of that that's going to build that so you don't go too far and then break down. So activities that do that is things like your strength training that you mentioned before. So bringing in other elements that kind of support what you do to make sure you have the capacity to deal with the amount of training you want to do is important. And then supporting that again with things like making sure that you get in enough nutrition, that you consider things in your life that might also contribute to your overall like state. So what's your work-life balance like at the moment? Like how much time are you actually giving up to your training and compromising on things like sleep? Like all of that needs to come into it as well, because sometimes people don't change anything in their training and they get injuries because they're doing the same amount, but other stuff kind of comes in that undercuts what they're doing. So they have a really stressful week at work. They don't recover as well. They don't sleep very well because it's really hot. Like the past couple of nights, it's been really warm. All these things can contribute to then how well you're actually recovering and your capacity to then be able to deal with doing more training later.
Does anyone want to explain why those things? Do you want to explain why, Sam?
I think it's probably, again, having that sort of understanding of what's going on, like at a cellular level, is probably better directed
Absolutely
at Jack. But
is that your way of saying I don't know what you're talking about?
Well, I think a simple way to put it is the psychological and emotional stresses we experience from a stressful work a week, personal, family stresses,
or even lack of sleep,
have physiological effects. And actually it pretty much feeds into some of the things I suggested before in terms of how that influences inflammation in the body, how it influences oxidative stress, and particularly with a lack of sleep, how it slows down the ability for your body to get that out of your system, essentially, because it starts to increase stress hormones, which is okay if you're doing it in short bouts every now and then, but if you have stress just bombarded for long periods of time, that's when you start to see a lot of imbalances and then an association of an increased incidence in injury.
And that's exactly what Sam's, I think, is what you're trying to allude to, Sam, of like if you may not be overtraining, but you're under recovering.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. And I think that's one of the key ones. I'm conscious of time, but I wanted to talk about biomechanics and how that can influence, because obviously we spoke a little bit about shoes last time you were with us, but potentially the interplay between biomechanics and injury development. And I think one of the key things, I was lucky enough to get asked to go and do a presentation to the masters group at the Physio Masters, Sports Masters group at Latrobe this week. And I've done it the last few years. We do like a running practical session. And I just said, like, you need to think about the idea that biomechanics in themselves may not necessarily be a problem unless you feel like it's one, going outside a certain bandwidth, or you're going to do lots and lots of cycles of that stress. It's exactly what we're saying. Like, if the volume of what you're doing, even if that stressor is small, right, and it's an aberrance, so, like you don't think the mechanics are great, like someone's, really heavy heel strike or something. And if they're only doing 5K runs 3 times a week, they can get away with it.
Yeah.
But if they're doing 150 or 200 Ks and they're running like that, you're not surprised that they end up then developing some sort of like bone stress type injury, because the number of cycles that they've accumulated that stress and it's outside of what is considered maybe an optimal running pattern for them is actually leading to like degradation and not enough recovery.
Like running as a sport, or distance running in particular, is one of the most repetitive, like high load sports that you can possibly do. Like it's this.
It's a good way of thinking about it.
It's so repetitive. Like if you do a marathon, how many steps are you taking in that? That's like 40,000 steps probably.
And it's not actually worth emphasizing enough the actual amount of load you're applying with each step, because it's your body weight multiplied by acceleration of gravity. You know, what is it, about 3 times your body weight?
Distance running is around 3 times.
With each step.
Yeah, and that's going through the whole, so it's the ground reaction force. But at the ankle, it can be 8 to 10 times.
Yes.
At the knee, it's similar, like around 8 times. At the hip, it's a little bit less. But these are many multiples going through your joints consistently.
And I think when you think of it like that too, when you think of, say, a heel strike versus more of a forefoot strike, you can start to really appreciate how the accumulation of stresses in a particular part of the foot, ankle, Achilles complex can start to accumulate very quickly.
And how those different mechanics can actually influence which part of your body you're loading, and therefore which injuries you're more likely to.
Let's talk about that.
I was going to say, is there an optimal way then for how we run with women doing submaximal sprinting?
Yeah, I mean, submaximal sprinting.
Jogging.
I think like John mentioned before, there's different, like you can get away with certain things if you're doing a low volume, but if you're going to be increasing the amount of running that you're doing and you're trying to train for a longer distance, for example, you're going to be much more at risk of things kind of happening around your foot, your ankle, your calf, if you're adopting more of a forefoot strike or midfoot strike, just because of the way that you're kind of landing and absorbing those ground reaction forces. If you're landing a bit more rear foot, you're going to tend to take things more up your shin towards your knee sort of area, and that'll absorb a lot more of the load. Now,
I think the thing, like I was trying, and this is something that I tried to say to the guys during the week, is the thing you need to think about is very much like you have to take off. I think a lot of clinicians think about it very much just like, where's the load going and blah, blah, blah. But like think about it at a lower level of principle, which is if I have as much tissue, like I have tissue through my leg that I want to dissipate the ground reaction force across, what's the best way for me to do that so it doesn't overload any one particular tissue at a more significant way? The way to do that is use as much of that tissue and as evenly distributed as I can, right? And in terms of foot strike, that means that you probably want to use as great a surface area as possible, right? Because we know that the greater base of support, the more foundation it will create, the more likely it is that it's going to be able to be like you'll yield, through those joints more evenly if more of your foot is in contact with the ground. So whether you bias towards the back of your foot or the front of your foot doesn't really matter. The principle that's failing there is that you're selectively choosing to not use the biggest surface area as possible, right? And when you do that, the risk of you overloading a particular tissue goes up because you're not spreading that over as much surface area. And that's something that, like, a lot of people, when I said that the other day, they were like, oh, that makes perfect sense. I was like, it's not that there is a best way to run, but the reality is if you are thinking that you would like to, create absorption through as much tissue as possible, make sure you create the best opportunity for that. And the best way to do that in distance running is actually to have a whole foot landing, right? Which a lot of these shoes don't actually allow you to do, which I think is very interesting.
Yeah, I think shoes as well, if we go down that kind of rabbit hole for a second, is that like a lot of them will be a lot more built up at the back of the shoe, and it feels more comfortable for a lot of people to strike pretty heavily through that kind of heel. And, yes, they eventually will get a whole foot sort of contact with the ground, but maybe that's not happening whilst they're actually absorbing that ground reaction force. That's happening as they transition into mid-stance and as they go to toe off, less so at that impact point. They may be landing in a significant amount of dorsiflexion, and a lot of that load goes straight up through the heel. So, yes, it getting that whole foot contact at like that point where you're absorbing the ground reaction force, I imagine, can really help distribute some of that shock and some of that.
In my mind, in my mind, like I actually encourage more general beginners to use a whole foot landing, right? Which it sounds like it's not necessarily what you agree with. So, do you want to explain that?
It's to be honest, my stance on it is that I'm not as stressed about where you're landing originally when you don't have pain as well.
And particularly, like as you mentioned before, if this is a recreational runner that's doing, 15 kilometers per week, are they going to build up enough stress from training to lead to certain types?
Here's the question then: if they do have pain.
Yes. So someone comes in, they have significant like patellofemoral pain. They strike really heavily through their heel, and it's actually quite, maybe they're overstriding a little bit and they're landing in front of themselves as well. That's not an optimal way to distribute that load throughout their lower limbs so that they can potentially run more without getting the knee pain. For someone like that, I'm going to encourage them to land a little bit further forward and use more of their whole foot during landing rather than that heel.
What's your thoughts on these recommendations of increasing cadence?
Literally, I was going to ask, because you certainly see a lot of researchers at the moment who are talking about injury prevention and running, saying higher cadence, smaller stride length. What are your thoughts?
I think a nuanced approach is better.
So
that was very, very good.
What's wrong with that approach then? What's wrong with that generic statement to say increase your cadence and you'll mitigate injury?
Well, some people who increase their cadence, their stride length will decrease and they'll find themselves landing a little bit more like
close to the center of mass.
That does happen for some people. It doesn't happen for everyone. And it also like it kind of just like it doesn't address the individual in front of you, which I think is the issue with it.
Yep.
Like you've got like there was someone I saw the other day who like they were just testing some shoes out, but it was kind of like they had ongoing Achilles issues. They've had them for ages. Their stride was so like long, and they were landing like right on their toes.
Yeah, and
I was like,
very
well,
obvious that there's a biomechanical contributor. It's not that it's the only cause, but it's a contributor.
Yeah, and it's kind of like, well, okay, so is shifting them to like increase their sort of cadence going to help their Achilles tendinopathy? Like,
probably not.
Yeah, like addressing their biomechanical factors overall might, and encouraging them to do some other things to make them a little bit more efficient.
This has been a bugbear for a long time because you get people who I think making these generic recommendations and not really thinking about what that individual, why they've developed that running, style or running biomechanics, why it's actually ended up in that place.
Yeah. So can cadence be useful? Yes, but like, why is it useful and what does it actually achieve?
The other thing I think of is what you mentioned before, John, is about how you utilize the kinetic chain to dissipate and distribute forces. So if you've got a relatively high cadence, low stride length, are you building up enough active stiffness around your knee and hip to be able to distribute forces throughout the whole?
That's the argument that I've given a number of times of like, as a clinician, you have to be really careful because most people care much more about performance than they do about like running with a little bit of soreness, for instance. So you might think you're really clever because you took their Achilles pain from, 3 out of 10 to 0. But if you slowed them down 20 minutes in their marathon, they're probably going to punch you in the face, right? Like, oh, I got through. I didn't have any pain. It's like, yeah, but it was 20 minutes slower. So I'd rather cop 3 out of 10 pain for the last 10 Ks.
And this is actually, to be fair, like, you said it's nuance. And it's actually a good example where, like, if you're someone who goes, I just want to try something, I'm not going to go and seek an expert, I'm just going to try and increase my cadence, you might actually find it helps a little bit in the short term. Does that set you up for
future success?
Probably not. And this is where you see some of the limitations of these generic recommendations that are often touted or given.
Yeah, generic recommendations are huge across the whole like running industry, particularly as like a social industry now as well, where you can get kind of online programs that, I think there are some that actually can be quite useful for people when they're first starting. Things like Cash to 5Ks actually don't work too badly, like because it actually encourages things that people wouldn't otherwise do, like walk running and things like that. But then these generic programs and the idea, like I need to increase my speed training. It's like, well, why? Like, what
speed a limiter for you? At this point?
What are you trying to achieve? Are you just doing it because you saw someone on Instagram say you had to do speed training to become a better runner? It's like, is that actually what will make you a better runner? Does that decrease or increase your like running injury risk? Like, and so I think there's a massive lack of nuance missing across the whole running space, which could be much better addressed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is there anything else that I think we could probably go on for another 5 hours, but is there anything else that you wanted to ask, Jack?
No, look, one thing I was going to
say?
mention, I thought it was a good example you used before of the guy who came in for shoes with Achilles tendon pain, overstriding, is that balancing between biomechanics and tissue capacity too. Because, you could have someone who's got amazing calf capacity, for instance.
Yeah, they're really strong calves, lots of endurance, lots of power. They got good plyometrics. They can hop and they can do all those things at a quite a high level. And
they might be a real 4-foot striker loading up their Achilles tendon a lot and not getting any pain until they do. And this is where, again, it gets nuanced to be like, well, does someone need to work on their biomechanics? Does someone need to work on their tissue capacity as well? So, i.e., do they need to change how they run, or do they need to spend some time in the gym building up strength in certain muscle groups to be able to then tolerate the type of stresses they're experiencing?
It's interesting you say that, because I have had that conversation with a few people recently about, like, people have asked me, like, why do I always develop, and it's more to do with sprinting, because obviously that's who I see a lot of, but why do I keep getting hamstring strains? And I actually had a conversation with a really good young sprinter, and I said, one of your issues is actually your anthropometrics. Your leg length means that you actually, to run fast, you need to run in a particular way, and it actually puts you at a significant risk of injury. If we change how you run significantly, you're probably going to run slower, right? But there's not much we can do about it, because he's reasonably tall, but he has a really long torso and quite short legs.
All right.
So in order to get into the right positions and create what we call like negative foot speed, like how his foot comes underneath him to propel himself, he actually needs to very aggressively straighten his leg, and he lands on quite a straight leg. Whereas if you're taller, you can get away with your knee being a little bit bent, right? But he can't do that because he's got quite short legs compared to his torso length, right? And he always has issues with his hamstrings. But if you test his hamstring capability, it's off the charts. He's only 19, and I think it's one of the highest I've ever measured on our testing equipment, right? In both bent and straight leg positions. His rate of force development is fantastic. But he still has these issues. And he said, how do I get around this? I said, well, we need to optimize these things, but you need to, at some level, accept that your anthropometrics are going to mean that you will need to run in a certain way to run fast.
Yeah.
And I personally sat around on it for a while and thought about it, but I thought it was a really interesting, like, realization myself of like, there's probably not that much that we can change about this unless I really want to alter his performance capability, which, is a discussion not only with him, but his coach that needs to happen.
It's a good example too of that nuance you have to take, where the tissue capacity parameters for that individual through their hamstring are going to be much more at that upper end to be able to tolerate the biomechanical stresses he applies when he sprints. And there's always going to be that particular relationship for that person.
And I think that you make a good point, because then there's always, like we talk about groups. So these people are like, oh, such and such never does any calf work, and they've never had Achilles pain in their life. And I do all this calf strength, and, to mean that they can sprint consistently. And those ones need to spend, more time running on grass compared to the other ones who they can run on concrete all they like and nothing happens.
I think it's a really interesting, and it brings it back to something you said earlier about kind of looking at a person and how